What I do worry about is this feeding a narrative that stokes violence in our country, that these false claims cause people who are angry about the outcome of the election to use it as a guise to protest violently. But I think to the extent all of us can help sensitize our friends and neighbors to be patient, wait for the vote count, and don't take the bait. If we can be calm, mature, and rational as we absorb this information, it will best serve our country.
That was Barbara McQuaid during a recent UMSI panel titled Voting While Misled: Social Media Disinformation and the Election. McQuaid is a professor from practice at the University of Michigan Law School and a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. And this is Information Changes Everything, where we put the spotlight on news and research from the world of information science. You're going to hear from experts, students, researchers, and other people making a real difference. As always, we're presented by the University of Michigan School of Information, UMSI for short. Learn more about us at si.umich.edu. I'm your host, Kate Atkins. Today, University of Michigan professors Barbara McQuaid, Jaron Buddock, and Ariel Hazel discuss misinformation, disinformation, and the impact of new technologies on the election. Moderated by UMSI's Christian Sandvig, the panel explores how institutions and platforms are responding to these challenges. This talk, which took place on November 1st, was co-sponsored by the Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing as a part of the UMSI InfoSpeak series. Let's jump in.
I'm Christian Sandvig. I'm delighted to bring you a panel of three extremely distinguished professors. Ariel, could you begin?
I'm Ariel Hazel. I'm an assistant professor of communication and media here at the University of Michigan, and my research focuses on social media and news, and specifically looking at how people's use of social media shapes their perceptions of news environment, including their skepticism of news, their trust in institutions, and their cynical attitudes towards politics.
Barbara, could you go next?
Sure. Thanks so much. Glad to be with you. My name's Barbara McQuaid. I'm a professor from practice at the law school. I focus on criminal law, data privacy, and national security. And I come at this problem from a national security perspective. I spent most of my career as a federal prosecutor, and I see information warfare as one of the greatest threats to our national security.
Jaron?
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Jaron Buddock. I'm an associate professor at the School of Information, also in computer science and Center for Political Studies at University of Michigan. I am a computer scientist by training, and I'm using large-scale observational data and sometimes large-scale experiments to study questions related to political communication. Some of these relate to misinformation, which is why I'm here.
Thank you so much. So I'm Christian Sandvig. I'm the moderator for this event. I'm a professor at the School of Information and also in the Center for Political Studies. I'm also the director of the Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing, or ESCAPE, which is a co-sponsor of this event along with the School of Information. So I think we should start with a very basic question. What's the difference between disinformation and misinformation?
The Department of Homeland Security actually defines disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation to be three different things. I think in popular media, we see the terms used interchangeably, and I don't know that that's wrong, but under the DHS definition, disinformation is the deliberate use of false claims to advance an agenda. And it's more than just a lie. It is a lie that includes what's called reflex control, the desire to produce an emotional response. That's disinformation. Misinformation is its unwitting cousin. When we hear something that is false or we read something that is false and we believe it to be true and then we repeat it, we are propagating misinformation. And then malinformation is the use of accurate information, but again, to address some bad purpose to advance an agenda. So one example of malinformation, for example, was when Russia hacked into the Democratic National Committee in 2016 and stole emails and then waited until an opportune moment to publish those emails. They were accurate, they were true, but they depicted some of the members of the Democratic Party in an unflattering light. And so that was a malignant use of accurate information or malinformation.
Well, now that we've covered a little bit of just the basics, I mean, how concerned should we be? There's a sense that technology has enabled all kinds of new threats and new problems. Does anybody want to give us a introductory threat assessment?
To me, those are separate questions. And when we're thinking about how concerned should we be, I am quite concerned about misinformation, but perhaps not necessarily in the sense of worrying about misinformation that's spreading on platforms as much as I'm concerned about the norms that allow political elite to spread such information. And so that's, I guess, maybe the first point. The second point is maybe connected to this role of technology. That's a very open debate, at least in sort of computational parts of this field. And that to me is a causal type of question. And there, I think the answers are mixed in terms of the role that technology is playing as opposed to other actors in the space. But maybe I'll start with that and let the others chime in, and happy to elaborate more as well.
Yeah, I'll step in. I mean, as far as the role of technology is that most of us are consuming political information in these digital environments, whether it's on social media or other types of platforms. And we're just inundated with a lot of information. And it comes in, it's not just the amount of information, but the varied formats. It's very cacophonous. It comes at us and it doesn't necessarily always make sense. And so very little of that we know is actually disinformation. It doesn't mean it's all good information. A lot of it's biased or incomplete or things like that. But what happens is when we're consuming information in these digital environments, it becomes very difficult and cognitively effortful to evaluate that information and decide what might be true or not. And so I think part of the issue with consuming information in these platforms is that a lot of people revert to skepticism as default. So we have this sort of two sides of this problem of disinformation. One is that people might believe false things, but also that people aren't believing true things because they've decided that the safe thing to do here is to just not trust anything.
Yeah, I guess the one glimmer of hope I will give is that I think as time goes on, we will find ways to address these problems. At least we have the power as in democracy to address these problems. And I wonder if we can't nudge the leaders. You know, we have an election, we have an opportunity to choose a leader who will traffic in disinformation and maybe one who does not. But short of that, I wonder if we can't have more grassroots shaping of norms as well. It's hard to reach people when the perpetrators are in Russia, but when they're our own leaders, political elites, as Ariel refers to them, if we stop voting for them or we shame them or we say this is immoral and socially unacceptable, at some point they have to follow our lead. And so I would advocate for, all of us being the change we want to see in the world.
All right. I'm hearing, that this is more about an information ecosystem and that we have norms that we should seriously consider. But picking up on Barbara's last comment, I mean, when we see the kinds of warnings coming out of the intelligence community, they're not warning us about our own politicians. I understand why they're not, but they're saying you have to be alert about campaigns coming from Russia and Iran. So is there a role for norms about the behavior of sovereign states?
At this point, there's not international treaties on this. The people who traffic in disinformation tend to be our adversaries and not our allies. But just as we entered into nuclear arms agreements with the Soviet Union in the SALT talks, if we determine that disinformation is such a dangerous weapon in society, perhaps that is something that we could negotiate, some sort of treaty that says, we agree to stand down and not do this to each other.
It's interesting to think of this as something that could be addressed by diplomacy or international treaty. What about science?
I mean, maybe as a computer scientist, I can take that angle, which is when we're thinking about at least misinformation that's spreading through platforms. Partly platforms can be responsible for spread of misinformation, but partly they're also a great way to identify, measure things as they're happening, and be able to basically deliver interventions. And the biggest roadblock for work like that is platforms that are unwilling to share data or their experimentation platforms.
Can you say an example of what you mean by an intervention?
I mean, platforms have done versions of these, especially after the 2016 election. There were, and leading up to the 2020 election, there were a lot of concerns about misinformation. And platforms had, for instance, flags. They would flag, content that is likely to have misinformation. They had interventions of kicking people out of platforms. So when you have these kinds of interventions, not only can you change people's information and environments, but also can actually measure the impact that has, right? So we talk a lot about the impact of misinformation, but the kind of people who consume misinformation might have other correlates that might be related to their attitudes and behaviors already. So if you take out that one one piece of problematic content or channel, we want to be able to understand what's the impact. So if you have access to these platforms and can maybe not only deliver interventions, but also measure how people change their behavior, maybe if you can reach out to those folks through surveys to measure their attitudes, then you can really start to understand what kinds of change channels are most likely to be effective. So that would be, I think, from a technology and computer science perspective, a potential, the possibility in terms of what we can do with platforms and experimentation and measurement.
Interesting. I mean, it seems like if it worked really well, you could have a potential for a kind of inoculation or repair or something like that.
Yeah. And researchers do that in small scales and small labs here and there, but it's becoming more and more challenging as platforms are closing up their data access channels, or they rarely ever had ways to collaborate for experimentation. So, but these venues are becoming fewer and fewer, which is really unfortunate.
Well, that might bring us back to the role of regulation. But before we go there, Ariel, do you want to take on this question of if social scientists ruled the world, what would they say about a healthy information environment?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And so I think Jaren's point about social science right now is very limited in what we can actually know about what goes on in these platforms, because most of them are pretty unwilling to do collaborations and data sharing in really meaningful ways. And so that's sort of a big concern. There's other things that we thinking from like a social science side of ways to sort of share good information. So a lot of platforms like Instagram and Threads and TikTok have made platform decisions to suppress news and political conversations as a way of sort of not taking a stand in elections. Of course, that itself is very much a stand because they don't want to be involved in politics. They don't want to be accused of those mistakes. That's sort of one thing we could think about is how to make those news environments be willing to either work with, collaborate, maybe even do some profit sharing with organizations that are committed to truth as best as possible and have editorial practices and journalistic standards.
That's fantastic. I feel like we have some health metaphors floating around because I earlier said inoculation, we've heard about experimentation, but now it's kind of nutrition. It's like you have to be sure that you're getting a steady diet of truth. So earlier, Barbara had mentioned, I believe she was referring to Section 230 when she mentioned that one thing that we could do to combat disinformation would be to limit the immunity enjoyed by the platforms at present. Do you think you could say more about that, particularly for people who don't know anything about that area?
So currently, the social media platforms are governed by Section 230 of the Telecommunications Decency Act of 1996. This statute is sometimes referred to as the 26 words that invented the internet. And because it gave them immunity from legal liability from civil actions. So if somebody posts something online that is defamatory, you might be able to sue the poster, but you can't sue the platform. And in 1996, it probably made sense to do that. Their goals at the time were to foster innovation and creativity and investment. Well, we find ourselves now almost 30 years later, and things certainly have changed. And using the same rules that applied then now really probably doesn't make any sense. And so I don't know that we need to completely eliminate that immunity, but I would suggest we think about amending it because with the immunity, the social media platforms are essentially saying, look, we're just like a utility. We're just putting the lines out there, and it's these other people who are using our platforms to say things. We don't have the capacity to monitor what's there, and we shouldn't have to because we're just laying the lines. It's like if you want to stand on your soapbox and give a speech in the town square, we're like the person who built the soapbox, right? We don't know how it's going to be used. On the other hand, what they also say is that when lawsuits are brought about their content moderation policies for violating First Amendment rights of the speakers, they say, hey, we're like any other publisher, like the New York Times or the Washington Post, and we should get the same protections they get to have editorial discretion in making our own decisions. Well, I kind of want to say, which is it? Are you a utility or are you a publisher? And so I think we are still having a hard time getting our heads around exactly how to think of social media platforms in terms of regulation.
Barbara, there's a lot there. I'd love to hear the other panelists respond. I mean, particularly, so first of all, let's start with, I mean, is this the pro-regulation panel?
Well, I think it's a complicated issue because of the First Amendment, and I'm not a legal scholar, but people are allowed to say things online. People are allowed to say things you don't like online. But I do think that there are small ways, again, very modest things that we can ask these platforms to do in ways that are actually very, very consistent with our laws. And some other countries have started doing this. So in the UK, for example, just like the US, it is illegal for foreign entities to get involved in elections and buy advertising and do things like this. And so the UK said, Facebook, you're now legally responsible for political ads. You have to confirm that political ads in the UK are not coming from Russia, are not coming from the US or wherever, that these are entities that are producing the political ads are British entities, British companies, British organizations.
I mean, it's still only part of the ecology that you introduced us to earlier in the panel about maybe some of the problems are coming from our own politicians, as we heard from some of the other panelists. Jaren, responding to Barbara, I mean, is algorithm transparency the answer? That was a particular targeted intervention. I mean, is there something we should do about the algorithms?
Yeah, I think that's a great topic. And I think when we're thinking about transparency, the way that I imagine this is sort of more like input versus output focused transparency. So some of those are like what is happening on these platforms versus what is it that they are inputting, like what is the algorithm itself trying to achieve. So I think that when it comes to the output, for instance, somebody saw a video that affected them, that's a little bit more challenging, right? Because it is like partly what we have on platforms is also what people have demand for and what they're putting on the platform, as opposed to what the platform is intentionally shifting people towards. If we can have standards for more of these inputs, like what is it that the algorithm is, for instance, if it's indeed, you can identify the degree to which it's giving more air to toxic or misinformation content, if that's sort of embedded in their algorithms, that would be a useful type of transparency to have. The issue with that one is that these systems are really quite complex. I think there was when Elon Musk came into power, it was like, here's our system, and it's it's a hairball. So partly it's I think it's a great goal to have, and I think it's a great, going back to one of the points that you were making before, for like scientists coming together to create standards before we regulate, because it seems like to me right now there's not enough agreement to say here's the exact change that we want to be able to regulate these platforms correctly. So if we have some of that, that would be a good improvement for, I guess, where we are.
To keep on the topic of regulation and transparency, I mean, are there other things that we should be doing in that vein?
Well, I'll just say this. I think you can at least stop campaigns from engaging in deep fakes. So, for example, some states are starting to pass laws that say if you use deep fakes for election ads, you must label them as such. It's not going to solve the whole problem, as you say, because it will only apply, the only people who will comply are those who want to play by the rules and are worried about the consequences of failing to do so. So a political campaign, maybe political action committees, and I think that could clean up some of it. So it's all part of the problem. But I still worry that, when we have U.S. laws, it's difficult for us to get to international actors, especially if those actors are hostile foreign adversaries.
It's a big question. And I suppose I am less concerned about any individual one piece of misinformation that Gen AI or deepfakes might sort of produce. My concern is that sort of the whole information environment, once we start really getting flooded with all of this bombardment of sort of bad information, that the biggest result is not necessarily that people are going to believe false things, but that people are just going to start tuning out and deciding this is too crazy, this is too difficult, and so I'm going to go watch Netflix.
If I can just shift us again for our last couple of minutes, I think one thing we haven't talked about yet is that the United States intelligence establishment released a warning, and the warning is that if you're concerned about disinformation in the election, you should prepare to be much more concerned, because they have indications that hostile actors are saving up their ammunition to try and destabilize the United States information environment after the election. So in other words, they warned that people are preparing to release disinformation about how the election was rigged.
Well, I do think that when it comes to those specific types of things, that is a case of where you have our foreign adversaries and bad actors this is a deliberate campaign to undermine democracy and undermine the United States. And I've seen some news organizations doing this and other advocacy groups doing this, but sort of warning about what we should expect in the days following the election, that we're really likely not going to know the results on the night of the November 5th.
I'll just say, yes, I think warning and pre-bunking is really important. I know that Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson here in Michigan has been taking some steps to pre-bunk some of the election lies that we might see coming down the road, so that people will be a little bit inoculated from those things. But what I do worry about is this feeding a narrative that stokes violence in our country, that these false claims cause people who are angry about the outcome of the election to use it as a guise to protest violently. But I think to the extent all of us can help desensitize or sensitize our friends and neighbors to be patient, wait for the vote count, and don't take the bait when we hear all of these things. That's the goal, is to get us attacking each other. And if we can be calm, mature, and rational as we absorb this information, it will best serve our country.
Thanks for listening. You can watch the full panel by clicking the link in our show notes. To learn more about upcoming events like this, visit us at umsi.info/events. And make sure to subscribe to Information Changes Everything wherever you listen to podcasts, so you never miss an episode. Finally, if you have any questions about voting or registering to vote, check out vote.gov. The University of Michigan School of Information creates and shares knowledge so that people like you will use information with technology to build a better world. Don't forget to subscribe to Information Changes Everything on your favorite podcast platform. And if you've got questions, comments, or episode ideas, send us an email at umsipodcast@umich.edu. From all of us at the University of Michigan School of Information, thanks for listening.